This is The Magician and the Fool podcast, episode number 5, Simon Magus, part 2. And we haven't had much going on with the podcast lately. It's been a little over a month since we've done any recording. But we also attended the Institute for Hermetic Studies 20th anniversary conference in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And that was an amazing conference put on by Mark Stavish. And kudos to him for all the work he's done leading up to this. But in putting this thing together, it was really special. The quality of speakers was really high. The caliber of conversation was really high. Everyone there seemed to be an actual practitioner with a lot of skin in the game. And everyone was extremely nice. But highly impressed with this. This is the Institute for Hermetic Studies. I would check that out, as well as anything that Mark Stavish puts out. Really high quality stuff and a really cool guy. And actually, Janice gave a talk at the conference. His topic was focused on the thought and practice of the Hermopolitan Egyptian paradigm. And before I butcher it, I'm just going to let it be right there. I believe the talk, as well as all the other talks at the conference, will be available in a publication put out by the Institute for Hermetic Studies. So that will be something to look for. Another presenter at the conference I'd like to give a plug for, actually, because his stuff is so awesome, is Hunter Yoder. He makes traditional Pennsylvania Dutch hex signs. And he's got some books on the topic and really approachable, really cool guy, awesome products. I bought a few. I'm probably going to end up buying some more. Really nice stuff. So check him out. He can be found at huntermyoder.com. His company is The Hex Factory. You can also find it on Facebook under that heading. So without any further ado, I would like to move forward and move on to the episode. Okay, so Simon Magus, part 2. Okay, and here we are. We are finally back. It's been a long time since our last episode. We had a lot of things going on between the three of us, and it seems like forever, but we are here to do part 2 of Simon Magus. I'm here with Janice, as always. How's it going, Janice?
Very well, thank you.
And with Alex Rivera.
What's up? What's up?
And so last episode, Janice and Alex dropped some real bombs on the audience with their knowledge. And Janice in particular threw a bomb talking about Simon Magus ending up in Scotland, and this is going to be part 2 for the Holy Blood, Holy Grail franchise. So stay tuned for that from Janice. And Alex dropped a few bombs, some interesting ideas about maybe Dositheos and Simon being sons of John the Baptist. So that was interesting. Very controversial. So we're going to just jump into it now, and quick recap. I think it's really important to focus on, or at least emphasize the Samaritan-Jewish relationship at this time, which was pretty tumultuous, and it had been for centuries, and actually continues to be a poor relationship. And this is the environment that Simon was involved in. You only have to look to the parable of Jesus and the Good Samaritan to see that Samaritans were seen as pretty outside the Jewish world. To say that a Samaritan was good was kind of a controversial thing, and so that was kind of the gist behind Jesus's parable. So obviously there were some bad feelings there between the two sects, I guess.
And that goes back pretty far. I think Alex has spoken on that eloquently in the past. I mean, that goes back to a pretty profound schism.
Right, and we covered some of that history. So what else did we talk about? We talked about a lot. If you guys want to jump in and focus on anything that we talked about last time, it's been months.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we briefly touched on the Simon-Helen connection, or the couple, or the Syzygy connection there. I mean, I know I talked about, Minerva and Jupiter being just, stand-ins of Simon and Helen, according to the church father Irenaeus. But I mean, we didn't really get into Helen in depth that much, though, and but she's definitely mentioned in a few sources. Like, for example, the Clementine Homilies kind of gets into this. It pretty much states that, not only was, well, I think we did touch on this earlier, but not only is Helen was, a concubine of Simon, but also
allegedly,
or his girlfriend, basically, but also a student and a disciple of John the Baptist. So I also kind of suspect that Helen might have been John's wife, and somehow he became connected, or she became betrothed to Simon later. I don't know. I just suspect that something's going on there, but that's just me, though.
Janice?
See, I'm not so convinced of that because John was highly ascetic, and he acts a lot like an Essene, actually, or I mean, he does have, of course, the Mandaeans claim descent from him, but if you look at John's practices, the fasting, the living in the wilderness, almost like a desert monk, the desert, monks of later. If you read the how the Essenes operated and how they lived their lives, I mean, John clearly, if he wasn't an Essene, he belonged to a tradition that was parallel to or perhaps related to the Essenes, and so I think it's more likely he was celibate and ascetic, and I think that that's kind of interesting because the Gnostics historically fell along one of those two axes. They were either, sort of ascetic and disciplined, and they denied the appetites of the body to try and elevate the spirit, or they took the opposite, more libertine approach, where they, led a free life and didn't feel that they had to operate in a way that was constrained by the laws of what they believe the archons had set into motion in society. But either way, the aim is to liberate, the human being from the confines of the body and the world system. But what I think is interesting is if you look at, Simon and Helen, there's a very clear mirror image to Jesus and Mary Magdalene there.
Right, and that's something that you had mentioned in the last episode.
Yeah, and it's a paradigm we're seeing. It's a very clear. So, if you look at the traveling, preaching, the wonder working, the male and female working together as the partners, sort of mirroring heaven on earth, mirroring the heavenly psychology and the earthly psychology, so sort of embodying that Hermetic principle of as above, so below.
Absolutely, and I think the more we talk about the theology of Simon, the more we're going to see that.
Oh yeah, for sure. And so I just want to say, it's interesting because John does seem to have this ascetic tone, but then Jesus and Simon both went in the opposite direction, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Which makes you wonder, do we know everything about John?
Right.
I mean, well, God, sorry.
No,
keep interrupting you guys.
No, it's okay. I mean, there's really, really very little information about John the Baptist anywhere, and so it's hard to say one way or another. It seems, I agree that he's definitely more of an ascetic on the ascetic side, but it's really hard to say for sure.
Well, and there's theorizing that, how Jesus inferred very, very directly that John was the reincarnation of Elijah. That would further support John being the prophesied Essene teacher of righteousness. Because the Essenes sort of had a messianic figure called the teacher of righteousness that they prophesied, and according to some perspectives, that perhaps that was John. So it would make sense that, and that would make sense too, because John is definitely seen among the Mandaeans and even among some later Gnostic groups as a sort of savior figure. Mm-hmm. So that would, so if you consider all three of them, John to some was a savior figure, Jesus to others was a savior figure, and then you have Simon acting as a savior figure to yet another group. So again, we see a replicated paradigm,
Right. Alex, were you going to say something, or did we?
Oh, yeah. No, I was just going to say that the Nag Hammadi seems to me that it comes from more of an aesthetic strain of Gnosticism, or at least most of it. I mean, some of it's more orthodox. You really don't see much libertine stuff in it. In fact, that kind of goes against it. Well, Episophia also seems to actually actively go against the libertine movement of certain Gnostic sects, because it actually specifically condemns, the practice of eating sperm and menses. And in the Episophia, in the books of J.U. also condemns this practice.
So Janice, you would be out.
Well, I think it could also be a response to the allegations, though.
Right.
Like those, because I think those references in the Pistis Sophia, and is it the books of the Savior or the book of Yehu that says that? Well, either way, I think what it's talking about is it could just be a response to the sort of slanderous allegations leveled at the Gnostics by the emerging orthodoxy, because I do think that the libertine strain of Gnostics, they weren't doing the things that the church fathers were accusing them of. I don't really believe that. And it's been, it's really not believed that some of the more extreme practices were being done. Like most scholars don't take those allegations seriously anymore.
Yeah, I mean, we do have to look at the context. So, if you look at some of these societies that were very strict, just maybe dating outside of marriage would have been considered, you were having an orgy. So the context of the time also, I think we need to look at what was considered radical back then. I mean, I know the Romans were doing some radical things, but as far as the Jews and Samaritans, maybe things that we wouldn't really consider being very radical was considered over the top.
What you also have to understand too is among the early Christians, the practice during the meetings and was called, there was a practice called the love feast, which was a communal meal that they would share, and they would call it a love feast. And so I think that and I think that this practice was fairly widespread among many of the early Christian groups. And I think that that's really the origin of the so-called orgies, is the church fathers were deliberately saying that the Gnostics were perverting the love feast, or that, the so-called love feast was an orgy, when in reality it was a reenactment of the Last Supper, which and the Last Supper in itself is a reenactment of a heavenly mystery. So, but let's, I want to stay on topic. I don't want to.
All right, yeah, it's this topic is so fascinating. It's really hard to stay on topic because there's so many different ways we can go, and I won't even go there. I have some other things I was going to say, but forget it. Let's just move on. Since we're talking about, in the last episode we did talk a lot about the historical accounts. So the historical accounts, we were talking about the interactions between Peter and Simon, and we won't rehash all that, but listen to the last episode if you want to get some of that action. But I do think it's interesting to note. I did use GRS Mead for a lot of my research, and I found something interesting that he had put in his work on Simon Magus, a contradiction of the Church Fathers, which speaks volumes, I think. I forget who he's quoting, but in Acts you have the apostles converting the Samaritans, and Simon, had to flee, and he's rejected and humiliated, right? I mean, that's kind of the common. That's the common story that most people know. But funny enough, you look at Justin, who was a native of Samaria, who was another church father. He said that 100 years after that happened in Acts, or actually, Justin lived 100 years later. He said that all Samaritans were Simonians, or many, like a majority of Samaritans were Simonians. Which, how can Simon have been so humiliated and shown up and rejected, and he ran off and took his ball and ran away, but yet 100 years later the majority of Samaritans are Simonians. So I think that's an interesting contradiction to look at.
Well, exactly. It's just it's more evidence that contradicts the narrative that was really built. It was polemic. It's a slander narrative.
Right.
It was just meant to discredit a group that was seen as a threat to the emerging consolidation of power. Which was really politically motivated.
Okay, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the Simonian beliefs become the main motifs of later Gnostic systems,
Right.
So, the idea that Simon, in Acts he says he was baptized by Philip, and then he was rebuked by Peter. I don't know how true that is, but who knows?
Right.
But he was popular enough that he made it into Acts, so there's that, Well, good, but I want to kind of get into, this might be a good segue for the actual theology of Simonianism.
Sure.
So, in Simonian religion, they believe in a fallen female power called the epinoia, or the anoia, right?
Yep.
So, they believe that she was basically she's analogous to Sophia, basically, just Sophia. But they believe that she reincarnated, or this fallen power reincarnated to different incarnations. Like, for example, Helen of Troy, she's one of these incarnations. And some might argue that Mary Magdalene might have been another one of these incarnations. Or Helen, so they're all kind of the same character. And it's also interesting, I might get a little off topic here, but there's a group or a prophet by the name of Elchasai, he's mentioned. He's mentioned by Hippolytus, but he believed that Jesus also reincarnated into different beings or characters throughout history, like Seth is one of these incarnations, or more like Seth was like, or Jesus was an incarnation of Seth, you know. So now they also believed in a transcendental Father, and then they also believed that the law was given by angels, and that the material world was created by these same angels, and but these are fallen angels, basically. They're the archons, they're the principalities and the rulers that Paul talks about in Ephesians, you know. So, but a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, but a lot of the church fathers accuse the Simonians, kind of getting back to what we just discussed earlier, of being libertine. And, people like, Carpocrates or the Fabianites or the Barbella Gnostics or the Cainites, they all kind of tended to that same sort of libertine practice, It's kind of very tantric, but we'll get to that. But what do you guys think?
No, it's a great point. I would argue, and I'm curious to see what you think about this, Janice, that not only was Helen reincarnated in these historical figures dotted from place to place and time to time, but that we all have that fallen thought within each of us, and that Simon was just kind of using himself and Helen as examples of kind of that narrative.
Right, the realized man and realized woman, yes. Well, that's the thing, is the Anoia is the lost sheep of the Nicene hymn, the soul that became lost in the, watery chaos, and the Savior sees her and looks down and asks the Father to send him forth to, restore her to her former glory, which is a reflection also of the drama in the Pistis Sophia, the sort of sacred drama. So what we see here is a Gnostic paradigm, because Anoia means thought. So the thought descends from the upper realm of the nous down into the lower realm, into the wastes, and becomes lost in the darkness of chaos. Now, this is this is something that also occurs microcosmically as well within each one of us, like you were saying, Dominic. And in this, according to what we have of Simon's teaching, the Anoia was also associated with Athena, which makes sense because Athena was the first thought of Zeus. She sprang forth from the mind of Zeus, fully formed. In the same way, Sophia sprang forth from the pleroma and descended into the chaos.
And we see this also in Hermeticism.
Right.
In a very similar story, which Simon would have been privy to.
And this is Minerva or Athena, she was born via parthenogenesis. I mean, she was not born via a mother. She was born directly from the mind of Zeus. So this is important because in this myth of Sophia, then what we see is Sophia attempting to emulate the pattern of her own birth by giving birth to the demiurge independently of her consort. So in the same way that Athena was born of a father without a consort, and keep in mind that Athena is the goddess of wisdom. So, so this is a direct corollary here. So then we see the goddess of wisdom turns around as Sophia and attempts to reproduce that same paradigm, that same model, and in doing so engenders the demiurge.
So, Janice, could we talk about how Simon, in doing this, in framing himself as Zeus or Jupiter, and framing Helen as Athena or thought, and Simon being the great power, how is this in? I mean, this is how magical practice works, right? You are lining up as many things as you can, as above, so below, in order to harmonize, right? And it seemed as though Jesus was doing the same, as you mentioned, with Mary Magdalene. Can you talk about how, on a more down-to-earth level, what Simon was doing, if that makes sense?
Well, what it appears he was doing was attempting to mirror the cosmic union, the union between the cosmic man and the cosmic woman, in the earthly man and the earthly woman. Because
Right.
ultimately the Godhead was seen as androgynous and hermaphroditic. And then when the Godhead split into two, it becomes a male-female pair. And in Gnosticism, that's a very important concept because that male-female pair is called a syzygy. And so the idea is that in the earthly union of the male and female, the hieros gamos of the cosmic male and female is reproduced, and what in Kabbalah is called tikkun, which is the repairing of the world, the restoration of the broken world, is accomplished because the harmony of the original unity, the undivided unity, is reproduced in the unification of the male and female on this lower plane, which is also referenced in a saying in the Gospel of Thomas. When you make the two into one, when you make the inner, when you unite the inner and the outer, when you make the male and female into a single one, there you will see the kingdom. And they're essentially describing a reversion from the state of multiplicity and fragmentation into the state of unity. So I believe that Simon was essentially enacting that mystery, and I also believe Jesus was doing that as well, which is consistent with the Gnostic teaching as found in many of the sects.
Right. So we're getting to the core kind of beliefs here. And also, we had talked about this recently when we were hanging out in person. Simon had a descent through the different layers, through the realms to get to Earth, in which he had to disguise himself from each of the archons, or from each of the rulers of each of the planes that he traveled through, which is the exact opposite of what the Gnostics were training for, essentially, to get back to the highest power.
And we need to take a little segue into Neoplatonic theology to really understand what's being discussed here, because in Neoplatonic theology there is two orders of beings essentially. There's the ascending order and the descending order. So we're going to step away from the concepts of good and evil, of right and wrong here, and we're going to think of things a little differently. You see, the descending order is the path that souls follow down into incarnation, into materiality. The daimons are associated with the descending order. The descending order is also the order that draws life and mind and light from the upper spheres down into the lower realm to make fertile, to facilitate growth, and to create the link between upper and lower. So the daimons not only are spirits of nature that maintain the coherency of the material realm in the body, but they're also responsible for drawing down the heavenly influences. And in the same sense, theurgists would work closely with daimons, because those same daimons are the ones that would bring the blessings and the messages from the gods, because they bring those things down from above. Now, the other order is the ascending order, and the ascending order has to do with the ascent from materiality and spirit. And in the ascending order, you find the heroes, you find the angels, because it's like Jacob's ladder. Those are the angels going up. Those are the heroes lead us upward by helping us to triumph over our lower natures. And as heroes, daimons and heroes are both partially divine and partially of another nature. They're of a medial nature, a middle nature. And the heroes, being part divine and part human, are the perfect facilitators of transition from earthly incarnation into heavenly realization. So the descent that we see Simon and Jesus both engaging in the Gnostic texts is a descent of the spirit into matter. And then the ascent that we see, for instance, Jesus doing, and we would hope Simon as well, is an ascent back to the realm from which they came.
And like I had mentioned earlier, I mean, you see the same descent, and we talked about it before, of the cosmic man in the Corpus Hermeticum coming down into the physical realm. And don't you also see this in the kind of the afterlife adventures in the Egyptian theology of after you die, you have to go through these different levels and meet with these different boss characters, essentially, and pass into the next level, and there's another boss character. Is that a fair representation of the Egyptian theology as well?
Well, yeah, because it's not considered to be this easy. It's not considered to be this easy transition. It's more like you described it. I mean, you're passing through different levels and layers. They call them pylons in the Duat and in the Amenti, which is the lower spirit realm. And this is not dissimilar to the toll keepers in Eastern Orthodoxy, actually. You do have to pass, and the toll keepers are another version of, the Gnostic sort of archons as well, that block your way and, try and keep you from advancing. So there's tests, which is why this is the path of the heroes, because these tests require courage and heroism and strength, because you are tested the entire discard. If you're going to make the journey back out of the lower realms, you are tested repeatedly as you are discarnate. And this also is a mirror of the Hermetic ascent, where when you enter down into the cosmic realm, you assume 7 garments, which are related to the 7 planets. And as you ascend, you let go of each one of these garments or bodies. So the earthly body we live in is really the most dense of the bodies that contains all of the other bodies that correspond to each one of the 7 heavens, which in Gnosticism were called the 7 heavens of chaos.
Yes.
So the ascent out is a gradual ascent out of materiality and physicality into a more purely noetic state, a state of eventually complete freedom from the mind, or from the body, rather.
In Egyptian religion, we look at the books of the dead of Egypt. There's the concept of the Onduat, right?
Yeah.
And it's basically like that. I mean, look at the Ophite Gnostics of Celsus and Origen. The way he did, Origen and Celsus, the way they describe, the astral realm, these all different heavens stacked on top of each other. They all seem to be very reminiscent of that, the Onduat, for sure.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I mean, and it seems as though Simon would have been a great catalyst to bring these ideas. If these ideas didn't already exist in Samaria, he would have been a good person if we had to say who brought these ideas over. You have to always take what the Church Fathers say with a grain of salt, but when they say that Simon was the father of all heresies, you have to wonder, I think maybe they were right on that one, that he did bring a lot of this Gnosticism, or what we call today Gnosticism. He's the one that kind of brought a lot of this over.
Well, and it's fairly clear that Simon was probably initiated. Well, not probably, definitely. Not only in the sect of John, but just as Jesus went to Egypt, we spoke about this in the last episode, so did Simon. And his theology is a reflection of that. It's a reflection of
right.
of that initiatory spiritual magic that the Egyptian priesthood practiced par excellence. I mean, this is the origins of Greek theology lie in Egyptian hieratic theurgy.
Are you guys there? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exalted or holy work. Yeah.
Okay, very cool. I'm gonna move us along unless you guys want to add anything else to what we were just saying.
Not bad.
So this other, the more I researched Simon and Jesus and John the Baptist simultaneously, the more I kept coming to Hermetism and the Mandaeans as well. I just kept finding myself back at the Mandaeans, and at certain kind of common denominators, common teachings between all of these different individuals and paradigms. So I want to talk about the tree, because that would seem to have been a major symbol to Simon. But first, I want to touch on the tree as it relates to the teachings of John the Baptist and of Jesus. So these are very popular sayings; everyone will be familiar with them. But it's funny that you don't see them compared and contrasted to each other. And then when you see what Simon says, it's remarkably similar, which really begs the question, why has no one compared this or brought this up before?
Well, that's podcast. Somebody's going to be writing a book on it and, saying it's their new discovery.
Right. So if anybody does that after today, then we know they stole it from us. But so in Luke, talking about John the Baptist, John said to the crowds coming out to be baptized by him, "You brood of vipers," this is a very well-known saying, "who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Therefore produce fruit worthy of repentance. And do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our father.' For I tell you that out of these stones God can raise up children for Abraham. The axe lies ready at the root of the trees, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire." So that last sentence is pretty important to remember. So then Matthew, talking about Jesus, Jesus says, this is Matthew 7, "Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is cut down and cast into the fire." So that's very similar to what John says. So Jesus being a student of John, that makes sense, right?
Absolutely.
Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them. And then Jesus also has another parable about a man has a fig tree that was planted in his vineyard. He went to look for the fruit on it, but did not find any. So he said to the keeper of the vineyard, "Look, for the past 3 years I have come to search for fruit on this fig tree and haven't found any. Therefore cut it down. Why use up the soil?"
There's also the fig tree that Jesus curses.
Right. No, that's true. I didn't even add that to my notes. So I mean, it's undeniable how similar those teachings are. Then you jump over. I'm going to jump over to the Mandaeans from their holy book, the Ginza. They have some really trippy stuff they talk about, but there's a lot of fruit imagery, there's a lot of tree imagery, and there's a lot of fire imagery. So, like I said, the more I studied Simon, the more I kept coming back to the Mandaeans. Not to say Simon was a Mandaean, but I think more to the fact that they all came from the same tree, so to speak. So in the Ginza, before all the worlds came into being, there was a sole enormous fruit. And when the enormous fruit entered a fruit, the great and glistening king of light began. An ether of radiance existed. From the ether of radiance came the living fire. From the living fire there was a light. By the power of the king of light came the great fruit and life. The great fruit came alive, etc., etc. So they talk a lot about fruit and living fire, and we're going to see that with Simon quite a bit, and I think it's pretty interesting. And so, according to Hippolytus, talking about Simon talked about there's a living fire. There's kind of material and an immaterial fire, and it's represented as a great tree. He considers the manifested side of the fire to be the trunk, branches, leaves, and the bark surrounding it on the outside. So the tree is kind of a representation of fire. So just like I was saying in the Mandaean work, the trees and the living fire. Let's see, but the fruit of the tree, Hippolytus is talking about what Simon taught. If its imaging has been perfected and it takes the shape of itself, it's placed in the storehouse and not cast into the fire. For the fruit, he says, is produced to be placed in the storehouse, but the husk to be committed to the fire, that is to say, the trunk, which is generated not for its own sake, but for that of the fruit. So, you guys want to jump in on any of that?
Well, it's very interesting to me because we do see the symbolism of the fruit, the tree. It's also significant because Simon commented on Genesis, and the tree is obviously very significant in Genesis because you have two trees. You have the tree of life and you have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And as an aside, if you look at the Waite-Smith tarot deck, you'll see in the Lover's card both of those trees represented, and one of them is represented as a tree that is on fire. So you have those two trees in Genesis in the narrative of Adam and Eve. I believe this is very important. I think also this is talking again, this also relates to a common Gnostic theme, which is treasure houses and treasuries, and the treasury of the light, it's called. So you have the tree, but then you have the treasury. Additionally, of course, anyone familiar with Kabbalah could not help but think of the Kabbalistic tree of life, especially the Lurianic tree of Isaac Luria. So this is all significant here because these things are more than likely very deeply interconnected. And again, Simon's teachings came not only from initiation and from tradition, but obviously from gnosis, from direct experience of the inner realm. That was the essence of what he was teaching, was things that he had seen and experienced. Because for the Gnostics, the primacy is on the direct experience. The direct experience is what unlocks the esoteric meaning of the parables and myths and teachings and lore. Also in Kabbalah, there's a teaching that there's the two forms of the Torah. There's the Torah, the earthly Torah, and then there's the Torah, or the Torah of light, which is sometimes depicted as the letters of fire. So just as we have the tree, the outer tree, and essentially the inner tree, we also have, the inner Torah and the outer Torah. And this relates also to the Mandaean mysteries, because in the Mandaean mysteries, there's actually the very concept of the holy book is an archetypal being, a light being. It's the book of light. It's a living book. So those are some thoughts I have on it. I mean, I could go on forever about it, but those are some initial thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize, and I didn't do such a great job of emphasizing it because I was reading my notes, of this idea of the concealed and the manifested aspects of the fire. And again, I see this in the Corpus Hermeticum, in Book 2 in particular, where I think Hermes is talking to Asclepius about the essence of the divine, and there is this talk of this manifested portion that you can see and work with, and then there's this unmanifested, concealed, unknown aspect, which are two sides of the same coin, essentially.
We also see, of course, Heraclitus. Heraclitus, believes that fire was the first principle, and the fire was the creative principle that formed everything. This is also found in the Chaldean oracles, where you see the oracles speaking of the fire flashing formlessly in the depths of the universe, and we also see the hyperzukos, the flower of fire, which is one of the names of one of the demiurges. So, the idea of the fire as a primal creative principle is significant and is consistent with the initiatory knowledge of that time. And additionally, you do find that the fire is a primary principle in the Egyptian traditions as well. I mean, in some cults it was the water that was first, but in others it is the fire, such as in Memphis or in Heliopolis. The fire is really the pro forma principle.
What do you guys think about this storehouse or the treasure house? Alex, you could jump in if you have any input on this, but I know the treasure house was mentioned in the works of Simon. But you also see it, like you had said, Janice, it's mentioned in other places. The Pistis Sophia talks about a treasure house. The Manichaeans talk about a treasure house. You also see the prayer of Apostle Paul from Codex 1 talk of a treasure house. My Redeemer, redeem me, for I am yours, the one who has come forth from you. You are my mind, bring me forth. You are my treasure house. So what do you guys think about this treasure house idea? What is this exactly?
Well, I have a lot to say of what both Janus and you said. So first, the storehouse idea. Well, that was a very common allegory that a lot of the Platonic philosophers would use, like the physician Galen, for example. So the whole idea of cutting the wheat from the chaff. Well, that really refers to the digestive process of the stomach, and that the barn or the storehouse is basically the nutrition, right? That's like absorbed into your body. And that's kind of like how, Jesus, John, and even Simon describes, believers being grafted to the tree of life. I think Paul actually talks about that too in Romans, where believers are either cut off or grafted in, basically, into this tree of life. But I always thought it was interesting that Galen also talked about how the stomach was basically the storehouse. So it also connects to the whole Simon idea of Eden, or the body being just symbolic of Eden, or vice versa. but yeah. So what do you think, Janison?
Well, I think also the treasure house, following the analogical hermetic principle, it also relates to the pleroma, because the pleroma is sealed like a treasure house. It is, that's why they're called the treasuries of light. Mani talked about the treasuries of light as well. Also, the Ishraqiya, the Islamic Sufi illuminationist school of philosophers who were concealing Hermetic and Gnostic teachings within Islam, such as Ibn Arabi and Suhrawardi, they also talked about the treasure houses of light. And it's remarkably consistent with Gnostic and Manichaean and Zoroastrian doctrines in that regard. And of course, in Gnosticism, the realm of light, which to people familiar with the Kabbalah, you could say analogize with the Ein Sof, or the realm of light is separated by a veil or a limit, a boundary. It's sealed, just like a treasury is sealed. So the light, the effulgence, it's impossible for it to be released from that place. So the idea of being from the treasury or returning to the treasury is also a way of speaking of returning to the pleroma, because just as in when you're dealing, for instance, an analogy I've used in the past is quantum physics. in this. So, matter, all atomic matter contains an antiparticle. So you have the positive and negative. But when it reaches the speed of light, there is no longer an antiparticle. So in that same sense, when you're getting into the esoteric ontology, the light realms contain their own form of matter, you could almost say. So the light is its own matter. So it contains itself. It's self-contained. And so again, that relates back to that treasury.
Right. So great points from both of you. Thanks for clarifying your thoughts on that. So the fire we talked about, it was also called, according to Hippolytus, Simon also called the fire in different places the perfect intellectual. He called the fire the boundless power and the universal root. So these are all different manifestations or ways to describe this universal fire. We talked about the concealed and the manifested side of the fire. The tree represents the manifested aspect. And Hippolytus also said that Simon says, all parts of the fire, concealed and manifested, contain intelligence. And I assume the translation comes from nous?
Yes.
Okay, so we're digging deeper into the theology of Simon, and I don't know that this is available anywhere in such a in such a format. You really have to dig for this information typically. So the fire is there are 6 roots that come from the fire, and from the 6 roots come the cosmos. The 6 roots equal 3 syzygy, so 3 pairs. And so let's talk about those 6 roots / 3 syzygy, because this is pretty fundamental to Simon's thought and theology. So the syzygy are mind and thought, also heaven and earth, voice and name, which also equates to sun and moon, and reason and reflection, which equates to air and water. Do you guys want to talk about those syzygy?
Let's do one at a time. So start with the first one.
So mind and thought, which represent, or in the Sethian kind of paradigm, can be the one and Barbello.
Yeah.
And it's also, like I said, heaven and earth. So you see that in Baruch, that kind of interplay between heaven and earth.
And for those people with the bent toward the I Ching, you could think of it also like that. You have the primal pair of heaven and earth, even in that. I mean, it's almost a universal dyad there, the heaven earth dyad.
Right.
And in different cultures, one is male and the other is female. So you have like the heaven and earth, and that's a universal thing in many cultures. But really, heaven relates to mind and earth relates to the body. So again, there's heaven and earth, there's nous and enoia. And enoia is also thought. And the nous is, mind, but it's spiritual mind. So there's really, if you think of it carefully, there's 3 levels that we're talking about at minimum here.
Right.
Nous and enoia. Now, nous, as we spoken about in our Hermetic episodes, as we've spoken about in the prior episode, nous is not the rational discursive mind. It is the cosmic mind of light. It's more like the Buddha mind in Buddhism. It is the formative power of the mind of God, really. It's the mind of God. So nous is this universal intellect. Perhaps Masons might see it as the great architect. Or the grand architect, I should say. And Noia is the active thought. In Egyptian theology, this is a pretty direct relation. This is pretty directly related to Re or Amen and the Eye of Re, because the Eye of Re was frequently perceived as a goddess in its own right. It was a living sort of deity, and it was feminine, and it was considered or first emanation of the god of light. And nous is also associated with fire and with light. So you have fire and light and mind and thought. So then the next hypostasis or projection or, unfoldment of that is in sky and earth, or heaven and earth, which is also like Uranus and Gaia, the two titans that produce the gods. And then you have it in the human body as the mind and the body.
And you can also see it even farther down the chain as Simon and Helen.
Exactly. The personalized, then you see the personalized form. And of course we've already spoken about Zeus and Athena, because Zeus is Nous and Athena is Anoia. So you have these different levels esoterically that pertain to these syzygies, and it is valid because the syzygy is considered to be a self-consistent unity, an undivided unity. The male and the female are like a yin and yang; they form a whole. So a syzygy is an aeon, and an aeon is a self-complete reality composed of a time element and a space element, you could say, or composed of a male element and a female element, you could say, or composed of substance and form in a Neoplatonic sense. So each one of these syzygies has those fundamental complementary, interdependent characteristics.
Right, and so in the Simonian theology, thought descends and mind must retrieve, and I think you see, in later, like alleged Sethian Gnosticism, we know what happens when the syzygy are not in unison. We have Sophia who then on her own creates Yalbadeoth because she is not in union with her syzygy.
Right. So, and that's also pointing to the fact that despite the fact that they're an interdependent unity, they also are, in addition to that, they also do have their own independent consciousness.
So would it be safe to say that on a more psychological level, if we're bringing this down like a fractal on many different levels, if mind and thought are not unified, then bad things happen psychologically.
Right. Well, it's equivalent to thought running off or becoming carried away with itself, and a mind that functions without thinking is a mind that is unwise, and thought that runs off without a mind to contain it, to put limits and boundaries on it, it can lead a person to all kinds of things. Again, this is the practical component of it.
Right. We're taking this down to the lower levels. But I could see this in conspiracy theories, and conspiracy theorists, people who are brilliant, but their wisdom is misplaced and they create some horrific creations, some horrific thoughts that are not in union with their mind, and so it's not going to be proper, or it's not going to be correct.
Well, that's actually valid because there's thought. The Anoia is also considered to be she is considered to be dynamically creative, almost like the Shakti in Shaivism. The Anoia is a creative power, like like Sophia in the Wisdom of Solomon. She is the creative power par excellence. But the creative power, if it is not wedded to mind, what is that saying? The sleep of reason produces monsters. You know what I mean? And that's exactly what happens in some of the myths of Sophia. The demiurge, the archons are produced from her transgressing her bounds, transgressing the nous, and her creative power becomes unchecked. And as we know, creative growth without limitation is Cancer. And that's also interesting because Cancer is the astrological sign that relates to the mother and to birth. So it does, again, tie back to exactly what we're discussing.
Alex, any thoughts on thought?
Yeah, I mean, Sophia, basically she becomes alienated from the nous or mind due to just maybe ego, you can call it, but she basically needs to be brought back into harmony with the nous, right? So you have these three different levels, really, but which, you have these 7 aeons of Simon that can be brought down or connected with these three levels. You have the divine world, the unmanifest triple aeon, as some Gnostics would call it, right? Or the pneumatic world. And then you have this middle distance or psychic or astral plane that, where thought, reflection, and name can exist. And then it goes down to the physical world, Malkuth, right? The physical world, or the Hylic world. So there's these three correspondences that those different layers or emanations can fall into. And yeah, like going back with what Jana said earlier about the treasure house being the part of this, the all, right? The incorruptible form. There's also Keter, right? And it all connects to this, but it's all part of this great cosmic tree that Simon talks about, which is his, like, the hidden form is the all-devouring fire, and the manifest is also fire. So, like, there's a hidden fire and then there's a manifest fire. But so basically, that this fruit, this eternal fruit that Simon talks about, represents, the divine spark, or the pneumatic man that continues to burn and grow within the true vine, So what's interesting, though, when you read Hippolytus, man, he really lays it out. But but what's interesting is that Simon, he also called himself the Alpha and the Omega too, by the way, that you see in Revelation, which also fits with the hermaphroditic standing one that you see as well. So he's like, basically the standing one is like the cosmic Christ, or the Logos in essence. But also, it's also interesting too, is that the tree of fire can be seen as a symbol of the Queen of Heaven, or Ashtoreth, in the first temple too. And I think in Isaiah 44 it talks about how Yahweh is also described as a hermaphroditic God that gives birth to Israel. It's kind of weird. He's like, he's a father figure. Yeah, he's also has feminine traits as well. But the Queen of Heaven and the Tree of Fire are very much connected for sure.
So the next syzygy is voice and name, also sun and moon. So Janice, take it away.
So that's phone and onoma. Voice and name correspond again to the two aspects that are interdependent. They're again, we have another syzygy, and with it, you almost have the another aspect of the syzygies is the hidden and manifest side, or the hidden and the revealed side. So we have a voice and we have a name. So we also have form and substance here. You could say the voice is the substance and the name is the form.
It's similar to mind and thought. You can't have thought without mind.
Right, exactly. One gives substance, the other gives form. Now with the sun and moon, that's pretty interesting, because it also, the trait that both of those share is luminousness. Mm-hmm. So you have sun, which is the masculine radiant principle, and then you have the moon, which is the feminine radiant principle. And again, we often see Sophia associated with the moon, with Selene, or Diana. More Selene usually, though. And actually, Helena or Elena is a name of the moon. It's a name of the moon goddess. There's a very significant aspect there. So the name is something very close to the logos. The logos and the name are sort of part and parcel of the same thing. The logos is the divine name spoken into creation, which gives form to all of creation. It's the pattern. It's also the spoken, the coming forth and the spoken thing. Just as the sun and moon order time, the rising and setting of the sun create, and the movement of the sun in the circle of the heavens creates the passage of time in the year, just as the movement of the moon during the month creates the passage of time in the month. So here again, we're going to an even more personal level too, because we went from sky and earth now to moon and sun. So we're talking about luminaries within the sky now.
And I mean, it's obvious, but worth noting that Helen was also known as Luna.
Right. So Luna, Selena, Helena, Elena. These all correlate. These all correlate. They all connect back together. So you have this lunisolar, and again, the sun and moon in alchemy are again they are the subjects of the hero's gamos. In the alchemical process, the idea is to unify the sun and the moon. So here again, we see a replication of that process of the two luminaries, and so I think it's very interesting when you think about it. Also, the fact that the moon goes from full to completely dark could also be I can see how, in a Gnostic sense, that could be analogized to the descent of Sophia into the darkness, and then her subsequently being raised back into light, or elevated back into light. Alex, do you have anything to say on this?
Well, the only thing I got to add is when you talk about Helen and in their redemption of epinoia, we also have to take into consideration the exegesis of the soul. But I don't know if you want me to get into that in depth now, because I think we have a few more aeons to go, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, let's continue on.
Okay. Are we good with voice and name?
Yes. Well, also voice and name are associated with yet another thing too. So in ancient Egyptian theology, the name is a very, very important thing. Like everything that lives, everything that is alive has a secret name. And if the magician can know the name of something, he can control it. So we see that in the Isis actually, as the divine magicianess, acquires the name of the supreme god and thus achieves identification with the highest deity through knowing the name of that deity. So that's how she becomes also a powerful savior. So the phone and onoma, the voice and name, have to do with speaking existence into creation, or I create as I speak, which is one, it's considered to be one potential meaning of the word abracadabra, which is related back to the Gnostic Abrasax, figure. So it does connect. Also, the fiat lux, the let there be light of Genesis, but also of the Hermetica, deals with this.
Mm-hmm. And you also see the ascent of the Gnostics in their astral video games are taught to memorize the names of the boss characters of each level, essentially, so that they can have power over that entity and move on to the next level.
Yeah. And so name is really important because it's a signature of everything in creation. And then if you think about, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You have the actual voice And what does the voice do? Like thought, the voice springs forth from the mouth. So when the name is spoken, the voice and the name are one. And when the word springs forth, it comes forth as the voice, And in Kabbalah, the voice is often associated with the feminine principle and the name with the male principle. I believe it's called in one sense, in one iteration, it's called the Bath Call. There's the daughter of the voice, or the daughter voice. And then there's also the Baruch Hashem, the holy name, which is essentially the Logos figure. So in later Kabbalistic theology, you have that.
Okay, so the next Syzygy, reason and reflection, also called air and water.
And we see now where we had the nous, the fire nous before. Now we see the rational, analytical, intellectual mind, the reason, the air. And just as air creates a circuit that moves the water, because the whole precipitation cycle is related to the movement of air, and air communicates. But symbolically, going back very far, air is associated with the intellect and with the word. So there's both of these aspects there, but air is associated with analysis. So it's very interesting there because we have reason and we have reflection.
And I think water and reflection, there's an obvious connection there.
Absolutely. The water, reflection on water is the same thing as, what do we say when we're thinking about something deeply? We're reflecting on it. The process of reason should be wedded to reflection, Mm-hmm. So on a practical level, on the personal level, reflection and reason should be joined because, again, if one goes off and does its own thing, things become problematic. The mind can analyze things into the smallest parts forever. If reflection becomes a part of that process, then there is a passivity. There's an active thought, but then there's a pause to reflect. And so we have that. And then we have the watery nature, again, hearkening back to Hermetic theology and Hermetic ideas, and the airy component representing the spirit that leapt forth from the watery mass in the Poimandre.
Right. Alex, anything to add on reason and reflection?
Well, it's like the idea of in Genesis, right? You have a God moving over, or the spirit of God moving at the face of the deep in Genesis, which connects, of course, to the prologue in the Gospel of John. When the Logos also spreads over the darkness, and then he brings matter and creation into reality, right? So the Logos is basically the reason, not so much just mind, but really it's the reason that brings forth structure or order into reality. And then and you've seen that story of the disciples going to Jesus when he's walking on water, right? So it's just basically this idea that the Logos also brings, he calms the storms, the dark waters of the abyss, and then he takes control of it, and then brings or shines light onto it. So
interesting.
Very well put.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, you just pulled that one out of nowhere. That was a good one.
Yeah, I don't know. I just channeled it.
Nice. So I think the common theme that I'm seeing, and maybe you guys as well, is this idea of harmonizing, of harmony.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and paraphrasing Hippolytus on Simon's overarching mission with all of this, it seems as though if this imaging is perfected among the 6 roots, then you will embody completeness, and you will become the equivalent of the boundless power, which I think leads into how Simon then would be able to call himself the standing one, because he was able to embody this completeness on a multitude of levels. I think it's also about how many levels you can stack and how many levels you can harmonize. And if you can harmonize these 6 roots, then you can be considered the standing one, who is the equivalent of the boundless power.
Also, it's also significant, and I really agree, and I thought you put that beautifully. It's also significant that there's 6 roots, because the 6 is an expansion of the number 2, okay? And 2, of course, is a doubling of the number 1. So from 1 come 2, and from 2 come many. The reason I'm saying this is because typically the number 6 is depicted as a hexagram, which is 2 triangles, often known as the Star of David, the Magen David or whatever. It's also called the Seal of Solomon, because it's traditionally used as a representation of the union of heaven and earth, among other things, because the upward pointing triangle representing the 3 male principles also represents the father or the fire, and the downward pointing triangle, of course, represents the mother principle, and it resembles the shape of the yoni of the female, just as the upward pointing triangle represents the shape of the phallus of the male, and the 2 conjoined symbolically represent the primal unity from which male and female spring and in which they are both rooted. It's also a symbol of the alchemical process, the phases of the alchemical process, and the end goal, which is the gold. Really, it's the electrum, the gold of the sun and the silver of the moon become united in one substance, which is the reconstituted prima materia. From chaos comes order, from darkness comes light, and the light actually arises as the union of the 2 principles. So the hexagram is a powerful symbol of the union of male and female, which is important and a fundamental component of Simon's ideology and theology.
Very nice. Yeah, good points. I couldn't help also thinking the six powers, and this harmonizing reminded me of the Noble Eightfold Path in Buddhism, where if you can harmonize these 8 points, right view, right resolve, right speech, right conduct, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, samadhi, then you were able to gain liberation from the cycle of birth and death.
I think that's very well put. And I think that it's significant that we see that not only in the 6-fold root we see the 4 elements represented, but we also see the cosmic spheres represented, the cosmic, the cosmic forces represented. We see heaven and earth, we see the sun and the moon, we see earth, air, fire, and water. So we see all the components of reality represented in these syzygies, which form one unity. And that unity is really the cosmic human being, which, as Alex was saying, is hermaphroditic, is androgynous, is male and female, as one.
Yes.
2 beings that are united as one.
And what's interesting, too, is that in Kabbalistic lore, that both Adam and Eve are also depicted as androgynous or hermaphroditic. But, the fall of Adam and Eve was when they were split apart into 2. And you also see that too in Platonic philosophy. I think it's in the Symposium of Plato. He talks about these hermaphrodite humanity, and they're basically they're so powerful that the gods are kind of freak out. So they decide to split them apart because they're actually storming the heavens because they're so powerful. So I think Zeus and Apollo actually split the hermaphroditic humans apart. So I think that's where we get those ideas, though. But yeah, what do you guys think?
I think that's a very good point, and I think that it's also useful to realize that, as mentioned in the prior episode, the awakened human being realizes the principles of the gods within themselves. So the awakened or realized man contains all of the deities within their own microcosm. Because that goes back to the idea that mankind is not only a divine being and not only a deity, but mankind is actually more than just a deity. Mankind is an aeon. And the aeon of the celestial human actually surpasses the aeon of the cosmos that we live in. Because it surpasses it, and we contain the celestial man within each of us, we contain the universe within the celestial man which is within us. Because of that, we contain all of the deities within that cosmos, within ourselves. So when we see these ancient masters, such as Simon or Apollonius or Jesus or Abaris or Helena or any of these other people identifying as a divine being, it's not hubris, it is realization.
Right. I mean, you see it in astrology. If I'm currently studying Chris Warnock's Renaissance astrology, I mean, you want to manifest Mars if your life calls for that, and you do so by harmonizing with that energy. You make a talisman to Mars on the day of Mars, which is Tuesday, and the hour of Mars. So yeah, same sort of idea.
Yeah, and you would be unable to do that if you did not already have that within you.
Right.
And again, that's also part of Hermetic doctrine, that the human being, when it descends into incarnation, assimilates an aspect of each one of the 7 planets. And the compound result of the entire process of incarnation is a soul that contains each one of those 7 aspects.
Right, and you see this in Platonism and in Pythagorean thought as well, as we mentioned in our first episode.
Yes.
So yeah, let's cover the final big thing in what we have, the remnant of Simonism, is the analogy with the Garden of Eden. A long time ago, I had actually picked up a book by Alvin Boyd Kuhn, just by accident or happenstance, and the book was The Red Sea is Your Blood. And you see a lot of the same kind of wordplay and use of analogy. And in that book, he cites Philo of Alexandria, who talks about ancient sacred writings. And Philo says that there are 4 ways to interpret, four different levels to the sacred writings. There's 1, the literal or physical, which correspond to historical events. There's 2, the moral or sentimental, which correspond to moral instruction. There's the allegorical / intellectual, which corresponds to intellectual conceptions being taught. And then there's the mystical. So all of these 4 things are being taught at the same time, allegedly, according to Philo, in the ancient texts. And you see this with how Simon talks about the Garden of Eden. Do you guys want to expound on that view of the Garden of Eden in that story?
Yeah, I mean, basically Simon actually Hippolytus, but he's the one who quotes the Simonian doctrine of the Great Announcement. But essentially, Simon, or the Simonian author, was saying that Genesis' Eden is a pregnant womb. So basically, Eden is described as a womb by the Simonian author. So I can read a little bit from it, actually. I have it pulled up here. How then, he says, and in what manner does God form man? In paradise, for so it seems to him. Grants paradise, he says, to be the womb, and that this is a true assumption the Scripture will teach. when it utters the words, I am he who forms you in your mother's womb, in Jeremiah 1:5. For this also he wishes to have been written so. Moses, he says, resorting to allegory, has declared paradise to be the womb, if he ought to rely on this statement. If, however, God forms man in his mother's womb, that is in paradise, as I have affirmed, let paradise be the womb, and Edom the afterbirth, a river flowing forth from Edom, for the purpose of irrigating paradise, meaning by this the navel. This navel, he says, is separating into four principles, for on either side of the navel are situated two arteries, channels of spirit, and two veins, channels of blood. So there you have it.
Well, yeah, and there's multiple layers to this here, and some might not be lawful for us to speak of publicly, but one layer is obviously he is describing the genesis of a child in the womb, and it's interesting because he addresses both the umbilical cord that feeds the developing fetus, while simultaneously he also alludes to the streams of life force that are pouring into that same fetus. So there's these streams of life force that are pouring into the child, and then at the same time there is literally physical life coming from the umbilical cord going from the navel. This is also remarkable because it shows that Simon had an idea of the way, the actual anatomical way that a child developed.
And he's also describing living waters, it sounds like, and in the Mandaean world, living waters are pretty big. And in the Baptist world, in the Mandaean writings, the rivers are the arteries of the world, which is another kind of analogy which kind of fits here.
Well, yeah, and it's that classic tendency we see in Simon, the very hermetic tendency to do the as above, so below. He's describing Eden, and then he's saying Eden is replicated in the womb. He's and then you're bringing it to the level of also talking about how essentially the world is a womb in itself, and so you have a parallel to the womb and to Eden.
What I find interesting is that in the Testimony of Truth, it says that John the Baptist is the archon of the womb. And,
that's very interesting.
So he's almost like a demiurge. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it was also believed by the Gnostics that we live within the womb. Like the entire reality we live in is in the womb of Sophia. So, we have to get past the sort of physicality of the idea of a womb and think of what a womb is. A womb is really a vessel or a container that life develops within. And in the same way that it was believed that incarnation into the body was a form of death, it was also believed that the death of the body was a form of birth. So, death and birth are united here. And if you consider it in that sense, then the entire lifetime of a human being is actually a child developing in the womb. And it's interesting because I believe it was Stanislav Grof. He developed a technique called holotropic breath work. He would do it with his clients, and people would regress. People during holotropic breathwork sessions frequently and consistently would experience memories of their experiences in the womb of their mother. And the experiences often contain profound archetypal content, visions of deities, visits from spirits, a sort of apocalyptic character to a lot of the visions. And I encourage anyone listening to this to read a little bit about holotropic breath work. It's very interesting because the soul, while it's developing in the womb of the mother, seems to have very, very classically visionary archetypal experiences. So again, we have this, as above, so below, as within, so without, connection here. And Simon describing the womb, he's simultaneously, in that typical way of Simon, he's talking about like four things at once, because he would have assumed that his Gnostic audience would understand that when he was talking about the womb, he was also talking about all of creation.
I think that's a good place to stop. I think we're at the end of our time anyway. I'm sure we can all go on quite a bit longer, but I think that's a good stopping point. Alex, I just want to thanks you for coming on 2 episodes and dealing with our coordination issues, getting this all worked out, but it did work out in the end, and I think you added some extremely valuable insights in these 2 episodes. Do you want to plug your book again and talk about maybe how far along you are and a release date?
Oh, yeah. Release date, that's to be determined, but it's almost done. I am gathering a lot of more information that pretty much pertains to a lot of what we just discussed in this episode, for sure, especially with the idea of the descent of the Logos. You know how you described Simon descending to the different heavens. Well, you also see that in other texts, like the ascension of Isaiah, which is actually a Simonian text, by the way. Then there's also another text, which isn't really Gnostic, but it is definitely relevant. It's called the Gospel of Nicodemus, or the Acts of Pilate, where Jesus descends to Hades to free the captives from hell and Satan, basically. But it's all very much connects to what I'm talking about. But yeah, I mean, as far as like how long it's going to take me to finish, I'm not sure, but hopefully by the summer. Hopefully,
okay.
In the next 2 weeks, in the next 2 months, I'll be done. Yeah.
And the name of the book?
Oh yeah, The Sun Lady Unveiled. There is a subtitled Revelation 12 Decoded, but I may wind up changing that. I don't know.
Okay.
But we'll see.
And where could people find information about this book and about what you're doing?
Oh yeah, they can just go to theaoni.com and just take a look at what I have on that site. I haven't really updated it in a while. I've just been busy with the book and other stuff, but hopefully I'll get back to it. I may wind up rebranding it to changing it to something different, or changing the website entirely. But that's still up in the air, but we'll see what happens.
All right, cool, Alex. And Janice, thank you as always.
Yeah, and thank you for organizing all of this, and I hope that it's not too difficult for you to edit.
I have a feeling it will be, but hopefully it's recording, so that's the first hurdle.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this is a meaningful conversation, and I feel like we only scratched the surface of it, but it's good because I don't think that there's anyone who's gone this deep.
No, I really doubt it. I looked. I couldn't find any because I wanted to find that source. So hopefully we will be a good resource for people looking into this topic, and I'm sure we'll come back to it in our future episodes.
All right. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, guys.
All right, thanks, guys.
So there it was. Episode number 5 is all wrapped up. Simon Magus, part 2. I think it was a good conversation. There were other things we could have covered for sure, but time was limiting how many rabbit holes we can go down. I'm very confident Janice and I will return to Simon in the future. If you want to follow what we're up to, you can do so. The easiest way being Facebook. You can just type The Magician and the Fool into Facebook. You can also look at our website, themagicianandthefool.com. Check out what Janice is doing with the Hermetic Federation, hermeticfederation.com, and they have a Facebook page as well as a Facebook group, the Hermetic Federation. Also, I would like to recommend again the Institute for Hermetic Studies and Mark Stavish, all his work. And I mentioned in the show that I was studying Chris Warnock's Renaissance Astrology System. I just want to give a plug and a shout out to that system. I'm not getting compensated or kickbacks from this, unfortunately, but I do want to give some focus to people that are doing quality things and putting out quality products. So Chris Warnock, Renaissance Astrology, I ordered one of his courses and I got an email almost immediately, and I got the products in the mail within like a day. So the shipping was excellent. The product I'm extremely satisfied with. His website's jam-packed with information, so check him out as well. Okay, so that would be it for us. I will see you in the next episode. Thanks for listening, and see you later.